welcome to Provocation number 6, Grading for Whom? I'll start with acknowledgement of country and our beautiful country. We've got the sun shining today back on Dharawal land, but we're into the cooler seasons. Fortunately, we're still enjoying things being green, but we keep hearing rumours of El Nino arising. But in acknowledging our country, we acknowledge the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus footprint and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education. And as part of broader education, we have this provocation. So this is number 6 in our series, Grading for Whom. If you haven't registered for the last 2 sessions, we encourage you to do so.
Thank you for joining us today, Juuso. For all on the call, Juuso is a leading scholar in inclusive assessment and critical studies on assessment, based at Deakin's Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning, CRADLE. His research explores how assessment takes shape and shapes people in contemporary societies. His work has particularly unpacked how assessment practices reproduce inequality and how they can be transformed to support all learners. Drawing on his background in inclusive education and assessment design, Juuso brings deep expertise and a critical lens to the role of assessment in fostering equity, identity and belonging. So thank you again for joining us today, Juuso.
Thank you so much. And should I just kick off? Awesome. Wonderful. Let me just share my screen, and while doing so, let me also note how very jealous I am of that notion of sunshine. Greetings from my absolutely freezing office from the city centre of Melbourne. Here we go. You should be able to see my screen, and in a moment we'll see if you can also see my slides changing. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction. So for the next roughly 2 hours, I would like to share a couple of thoughts on grades and grading, with a title of Grading for Whom. Before doing that, here we go. You should have just seen my slide changing. If you didn't, then make them known in one way or another. I would just like to kick off by acknowledging the land from where I'm speaking from. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands, skies and waterways on which us, our Deakin students, staff and communities come together. And I'd like to pay my deep respect to the ancestors and elders of the Wurundjeri country where I am located today. So let me just start by being a bit provocative. So before introducing how we're going to use this 2 hours for, let me just briefly note what sorts of problems we're dealing with today. I would like to start by arguing that we live in an era of reimagining, redesigning, reinventing and rethinking higher education. This rhetoric of redesign is pretty much daily at this point. We see it in the news, we see it in research, we see it in the policies and practices that we engage with in our daily life. Here on the slide, you can see only some notable examples of this phenomenon. I think perhaps most notably, there's a section for articles in Times Higher Education under the banner of the Great Assessment Rethink, collecting articles about the very fundamental need to make sure that assessment is not simply just modified a bit in these turbulent times, but completely reinvented and reimagined. Similar rhetoric, of course, has been seen in sector-wide debates in Australia, such as in the context of Gen AI, which of course is something that you've heard a lot in this seminar series already. Now today I would like to share some thoughts on grades and grading. In this overall context of reimagining higher education, rethinking how we assess student learning, what about grades? I have not seen a similar urgency in terms of completely renewing the ways in which we assign worth and value to student achievement in higher education. So why is it that we are not rethinking grades as they are? So let me just start by providing the provocation in a nutshell before unpacking this for the next 1.5 hours or so. So I would like to argue that amid all this talk about assessment redesign, there is a critical silence in the higher education sector regarding grades. This, I would argue, is quite crucial. We have at least a century of scholarly evidence of how grades don't work. What exactly is meant by that, I will unpack in the following slides. But I would like to argue here that it is about time to move on and rethink how universities recognize and represent what students can do and what they have learned during their studies. I've divided this presentation in a few bits. I'm going to start by introducing what I'm talking about when I talk about grades. I'm going to argue that grades are a bit of a stubborn practice in higher education that tends to remain as they are, even during turbulent times. I will then provide a brief summary of all sorts of critiques out there in the world against grades. And after that, I think that's pretty much enough talk about grades. So we will move on from talking about these strange numerical indicators of what students can do into thinking about alternatives, which is where I will leave you today. We have 2 hours reserved. I'm not sure if we'll need the whole time. What I've planned to do today is to provide a presentation on these topics. I have some breathing points along the way for questions and comments. However, if at any point you feel like I might clarify what I've just said, I'm very happy to take questions and start dialogues already along the way. That's completely up to you. In the end of the presentation, I have prepared a bit of an activity. Let's just see how it goes. It also depends a bit on how much dialogue you want to engage with along the way. I'll just start by introducing what I'm talking about when I'm talking about grades, just to make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to the definitions here. And just to kick off with the definition with grades, we refer to the symbols that are entered into a central student record-keeping system, often some kind of an electronic system, that eventually appears in students' transcripts or diplomas. Now, here I'm making a distinction to all sorts of marks and scores, feedback comments that are provided to students during their studies. Grades are the final representations of what students can do that are institutionally placed into student transcripts. When I'm talking about grading today, I'm talking about the process of crafting grades. This is often done by teachers, instructors, lecturers, but of course also by, say, external markers, or perhaps even by artificial intelligence, a topic that we will return back to later today. What I think is notable about grades is that they are one form of data that we could provide to understand what students can do. And grades are a very particular form of data. They tend to be categorical and hierarchical in most, if not all, higher education sectors. Here you can see just a couple of different examples of different scales used across the globe. For example, I'm personally being trained to use a scale from 1 to 5, being originally from Finland. Quite often, student transcripts, as they graduate, they would also include a grade point average or weighted average mark score to summarize what students can do or have been able to learn in university. So much for the official definitions. I just wanted to make sure that we are on the same page here. Today, my focus throughout the presentation will be on understanding grades as an institutional representation of what students can do. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that grading is a part of a wider process of assessment. And during this seminar series, you have heard a lot about other bits and pieces in this process of assessment. Today, we will focus on the very last part, grades. So, the process of assessment starts by formulating some sorts of learning objectives. What is it that we want students to learn? And I think your next seminar delves deeper into this one. We would then want to assess those learning objectives in ways that make sense. How do we know what students have learned? What can I measure with an essay? What can I measure with multiple choice questions? And so forth. As we know, during these processes, we would be quite happy to engage students with some kinds of feedback comments, feedback dialogues. And after all of this, grading refers to the final way of representing what students have learned. And this is the bit that often happens in the very end, often relying on this categorical and hierarchical data. This is, again, just to make sure that we're on the same page here. So much for the definitions. Time to get to the more provocative stuff. What I find so very interesting about grades is that they tend to be rather stubborn across histories, across turbulent times. That is not to say that there wouldn't have been many disruptions to the work that grades do. For example, we can all remember the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that had for grades. Here in Australia, many universities tended to move towards pass-fail systems or systems where students could remove past fails from their final transcripts. And here you can see one example of a news article from the early days of the pandemic, when some university students here in Melbourne made their voices heard over wanting to benefit with these sorts of systems as well. Creating amnesty, it was called. Interestingly, even though universities worldwide adopted some sorts of policies during COVID, such as indeed removing grades or allowing students to forget about their failed grades, these sorts of policies went back to normal after the pandemic, which I think is a very powerful example of the stubbornness of grading systems as they are. There have been even more disruptions more recently. We have all heard about the AI-related issues and how those might impact the work of grading. Here's a very, very recent article published only a few hours ago, today, in Times Higher Education, about the grade inflation caused by AI-exposed degrees. And this article, situated in the US context, is all about how grades are inflated when students can use Gen AI to come up with assessments that are of higher quality than they would otherwise be. Here, the author argues that the ultimate goal of grading is to make sure courses are producing credible evidence of what students know and can do. Indeed, and here AI is framed as a force that might disrupt this sort of work of producing credible evidence, as we've all heard so far. What is interesting here is that even during such disruptions, grading systems themselves have remained largely as they are. There are very few sector-level conversations about changing the systems, but most conversations relate to tweaking the system in a way that we keep the status quo, such as in the case of making sure that assessment is AI-proof, so that grades would better represent what students can do without thinking about whether that work should be done by grades in the first place. Now, grades are provided in most higher education institutions around the world, with alternatives remaining at the margins. A good example of this might be medical education that has adopted pass-fail grading systems on a very large scale. Generative AI has pushed universities to rethink assessment. However, universities worldwide have not renewed their grading systems, and not that I'm aware of. I recently did a comprehensive policy analysis of my research context of Australia, Finland, and Hong Kong, and there certainly weren't any universities that would have completely renewed their approach to grading, although there is some ongoing work on that front happening at the moment, I'm sure. This is the fundamental dilemma that I would like to unpack in the remaining part of the presentation. What is it that keeps grading systems as stuck as they are? And why is this an issue? The issue is that if we only rethink one of a few parts of the assessment process, we end up in situations that are not exactly coherent or aligned. I have a very simple, silly example here. If we only focus on rethinking, renewing, and reimagining learning objectives and assessment, but not grades, we might end up in this kind of a situation. Imagine that you would have a wonderful learning objective that you would need to assess. Students learn to reflect on educational justice, equity, and fairness, and enhance their advocacy skills for those values, which, by the way, is a program learning outcome that I have once needed to teach and assess. It's a real-world example. Now, how could we assess whether this kind of a lofty goal is actually met in practice? We could come up with some kind of a authentic assessment design. Perhaps we could ask students to take part in service learning, community-based projects in some relevant organizations. We could make sure that we assure that students actually do those assessments of their own, but moreover, we could ensure that the assessment tasks themselves contribute to educational justice, equity, and fairness. This here, to me, would be a rather fantastic way of aligning the learning objectives with the assessment methods. But what about grades? Even after this kind of a assessment redesign process, the grade tends to be like this: distinction. It hides a lot of information. All these wonderful ideas related to assessment and learning objective redesign get hidden behind a relatively simplistic symbol, such as indeed distinction, in students' transcripts. And it is then up to the student themselves to elaborate in some future situations, such as in employment situations, what the distinction actually means in the context of this assessment task, in the context of these learning objectives. This is the issue that I would like to focus on today. Let me just start by introducing some common critiques on grades and grading. We are going to move on from here, but I reckon many of you might be interested in hearing what kinds of historical arguments there have been in the higher education sector against the use of grades. The bit of a provocative argument that I would like to make here is that we simply know, based on educational evidence, that grades don't work. There is at least a century of scholarly work stating that there are many fundamental issues in how we grade student work in the higher education sector. If you want to read the whole story, you may want to have a look at a freely accessible article by me and my colleagues from here at Cradle, where we unpack this argument further. But I'll walk you through some of the key points here. So what do we know about this idea that grades don't work? A couple of ideas. I've divided these critiques into different categories in terms of where they are stemming from. Where is this critique coming from, and what is it trying to do? And I will start with the psychometric critiques out there in the world. These sorts of critiques have claimed that grades are not very good measurements of what students can do, coming from the world of educational measurement. As a very notable example, Susan Brookhart and colleagues conducted a literature review of more than 100 years of research on grading in 2016, and they end up stating that their review shows that over the past century, teacher-assigned grades have been maligned by researchers and psychometricians alike as subjective and unreliable measures of student academic achievement. This is something that we simply know. To me, this is a bit of an unsurprising result, given that grades are indeed mostly provided by educators, by teachers, markers, not by psychologists or psychometricians, or by experts in educational measurements. Moving on from there, has been a long history of critiques of grading systems and practices, coming perhaps from a more pragmatic point of view. If the psychometric critiques focus on the measurement aspect of grading, these sorts of critiques would have a look at the issues coming from what grades are trying to do in this world, and indeed often failing to meet up with those expectations. Many of these critiques have focused on grading scales, whether they might be, for example, too detailed or too superficial. There's a long history of work on norm and criterion-based grading systems. This is quite a huge topic that I'm going to sideline a bit for the sake of time, but this concerns whether students should be graded with respect to other students or with respect to educational criteria, with the latter being more common in the higher education sector. There's also a history of alternative grading practices, looking at different ways of providing grades, such as specifications grading or labor-based grading, that aim to tweak the system to make sure that students receive grades in more ethical ways that perhaps aim to foster student learning in ways that are of higher quality. The next category relates to the communication work that grades aim to do. Why do we provide grades? To communicate what students can do. Are grades doing a good job in this? Well, according to many, such as Anastasia Lipnovich and colleagues, this is not exactly the case. What they argue in their work, that is a policy analysis of grades in universities, is that grades are difficult to interpret and rarely present a true picture of the complex nature of students' achievement or proficiency. What does a grade tell to our students? What does it tell to the university, to other universities, to employers? A very common critique, again, out there in the world. There are also more critical critiques in there related to the capitalist neoliberal underpinnings of university sectors these days. For example, Stuart Tannock argued that grading undermines intrinsic motivations among students for becoming independent, critically engaged, self-directed learners. Again, the type of learners who are widely held to be essential for preserving healthy democratic societies, instead substituting extrinsic motivations of working and learning to gain reward or recognition from others, or avoid failure or discipline. And finally, there's a long history of moral critiques of grading. One of my favorite examples come from 1892 by a Finnish educator, Mikael Jonsson, who was writing more than a century ago of how grades produce immoral actions amongst our students and teachers. According to Jonsson, grades encourage students to compete with each other and to focus on themselves above anyone else. It doesn't matter how the rest of the world is. Education should nurture students who are righteous, not selfish. Interestingly, this moral, and in the case of this article, also a religious argument about what kinds of students we should produce is something that I think is still quite relevant these days. So what I've tried to do here is to provide a very brief summary of the long history of critiques on how grades are not doing the work that they should be doing in higher education. We are not going to dig into the details of those. The key point here is that indeed there is a long history of such work. The question for us is, if grades have been critiqued so sharply for as long as they have existed, why do we still sustain them? Why is it that even despite all this empirical evidence, attempts to change grading are often met with suspicion? Oof, and I have a lot of stories about this. I can tell them later on if you're interested. But also by claims of naive idealism that belongs to a bizarro world, not in academia. And even in some extreme cases, police investigations and suspensions. These are some of the reported outcomes of what might happen if teachers or educators aim to change the systems of grading in universities. What is going on here? What are we holding on to so very closely? I'm going to start unpacking that question, the question of what is it that we are holding on to, by starting from the viewpoint of students. So to start answering my own question of grading for whom, are we grading because we are doing this work for students? And often this is indeed the case. This is an argument that I see reproduced across the globe. Our students are so very invested with grades that we are doing the work of grading for them. I'm going to provide some empirical findings from one of my earlier studies that you can access through the link here on how this is indeed the case in many contexts. Yes, students could be or become quite obsessed with grades, yet this might be the fault of us educators rather than the fault of our students. I'll show you some snippets based on this study that again is based on more than 100 interviews and a bit more than 600 open-ended survey responses from university students in Hong Kong and Finland. So what I'm trying to show here is that students very much want, and in some cases need, grades, which is an argument for grading for our students. The fact that students very much, in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, want grades is also one very strong argument for keeping grading systems as they are, rather than reimagining them. Let me show you some snippets of this relatively large-scale data set of mine. So students in these two higher education systems, Finland and Hong Kong, unfortunately not Australia. There's some Australian data here as well, but still under analysis. Students very largely refer to grades as a driving force for their learning and studying. In the article, I call grades as an engine, based on how students make sense of them. Students need grades because they provide an engine and a driving force for them to continue studying. And here you can see some quotes by the students. Grades are the gasoline that keeps me going. For me, grades act as an extrinsic, kind of like a motivator. I'm not sure what the right word is. They act as a whip. Yes, a whip. I would completely lose my goal of studying. What should I strive for in that case, if there were no grades? And finally, if I want to achieve good grades, there needs to be motivation behind it. A goal, something that makes you happy. Like how at work, you're doing well because you want to earn money. You need some kind of a goal. And why would anyone want this kind of a driving force to be removed? As the student in the last quote says, it's like money in our working life. If you remove these motivators, learning disappears. So of course students wish this driving force to be in place, to be in there, to guide them during their studies. So grades were seen largely as this sort of an internal driving force. But more than that, students were also referring to grades as simply one cog in a much bigger machine. When I asked these students what would happen if grades were removed, they didn't think that the question made a lot of sense, because that would mean that you would only remove this one cog from this big machine, and it wouldn't change much. In these accounts, grades were not seen as impactful in themselves, but they were seen as part of a broader societal ecosystem. For example, one student, when asked, what would you do if there were no grades, responded by saying, this kind of a situation needs to be tied to the job market and applications for postgraduate studies. Currently, not every graduate can secure a job. If there were no grade distinctions and everything was pass or fail, how would we determine who deserves to secure a satisfactory job? Many students in this study also told me that grades denote their value, both at the job markets, but even more broadly in life. One student told me that grades seem to be our pronoun. We are often defined by the numerical score or grade label, and over time, we start to feel like our grades define us entirely. Another one told that I might not even want to study if my performance wasn't graded. Without good grades, I wouldn't know how to define or value myself. If grades produce the value that we have in this life, or at the very least in the university, it makes sense that we do this kind of a practice for our students, indeed to provide that value and meaning for them. Apologies. And finally, many students noted that grades are something safe and meaningful in an otherwise changing world. they would not want to see change. One student reported that I can't really justify why, but grades make me feel familiar and safe. They have always been there. So what I argue in this study is that for better or worse, grades permeate the inner and outer worlds of higher education. Students need them for the internal forms of motivation and drive, but they also see grades as a part of this big machine of the society, employability markets, that simply needs to align with the needs of that bigger world around them. Now, should we continue doing grades as we currently do, or do the work of grading as we currently do, simply because students wish us to do this? That's a very tricky ethical question. It was not the students who built the system of grading, but the bigger system of society either. Students may wish to have grades, but we need to understand where this wish is coming from. And I'm going to leave us there and move on to another very important group of people in the work of grading, namely teachers. Are we doing the work of grading for teachers? You might think yourself, as an educator, and I know people attending today might have quite different roles at the moment. Regardless of your role, when you think about yourself as an educator, what is the first emotion that comes to your mind when you think about grades or marks? Do you feel excited? Do you feel happy, joyful? I can say that as someone who's done the work of grading for quite some time, it's not that often that you can see me smiling when I'm marking a pile of student essays. I do wonder where the joy of grading is from the teacher point of view. Why doesn't grading always feel like a meaningful professional task? Something that we want to reserve time for? Something that we would happily want to engage with? Yes, this morning I have a block of 3 hours for grading. Can't wait. Sounds funny, doesn't it? I do think that from the teacher point of view, we tend to see grading as something that we wish to delegate and automate. We almost wish that we could get rid of it, even though we do see it as something very important for higher education. We often delegate grading for casual stuff, exam markers, teaching assistants, or now more recently to AI technologies. There are many AI tool providers and researchers writing about AI enhanced grading that provides us with the tools that promise to save teachers from grading burdens. I think it tells a lot that many studies have explicitly referred to the burden of grading as they talk about the work that teachers do. Do we appreciate the art of grading as we talk about grades and grading this kind of a way? And if not, what has gone wrong here? Why is it that we don't seem to be doing grading for teachers as some kind of a meaningful academic job or responsibility? I think there's something very interesting going on here. I provided a few critiques so far, and I've been focusing quite heavily on talking about grades. Grades. Next up, I would like to change the perspective a bit. All this talk about grades is important and has been going on for quite some time. As I've argued, there has been a long history of critiques against and about grades, an even longer history of simply talk about grades. And that has been hugely important so far. However, here I would like us to shift our thinking and move on from conversations about grades to conversations about what students can do and how is it that we should make that visible. Let me unpack that. So why is it that after all this critique about grades, most of it extremely sharp, made by proper experts in educational work who really know what they are talking and writing about, why is it that not much has changed? Is it finally time for new approaches? Here I would like to argue that critique has run out of steam. Critique about grading has lost its power to bring about positive change. It has been extremely important, has greatly advanced our knowledge about grades and grading, but the job of critique is mainly done. So for the rest of the presentation, rather than debunking, moving away from something, which is what I've been doing so far, I would like us all to move our focus to concerns towards something. What is it that we care about, rather than what is it that we want to move away from? And well, in this particular presentation, what we care about is how we represent student achievement. What I mean by this is that grades are only one way of making visible what students can do, recognizing what they can do, but also communicating those skills to broader audiences. Grades are not the only way to do this, but for some reason, for one reason or another, we seem to be a bit stuck with that particular way of denoting, recognizing, and representing student achievement. So from now on, I would like to shift the conversation about grades to conversations about representations of student achievement, which is a bit of a mouthful to say, but bear with me. What do I mean here? By representation, I mean that we make visible what students can do or have learned, broadly speaking. And by achievement, again, broadly speaking, today we'll refer to all sorts of learning competency, skills, success, those things that we want our students to learn, which would of course be very different in different disciplines and contexts. So we want to represent those achievements in one way or another. And to do so, we must talk about representation of student achievement, which is the bigger umbrella category under which grades fall. Grades are one categorical and hierarchical way of doing this. I do want to note that this is indeed a bit of a mouthful. It's not a very sexy slogan, representation of student achievement. It sounds clunky. I know, it needs some branding. But for now, let's make the best that we can from these clunky words. So what is a typical institutional way of representing what students can do? And here the emphasis is on the word institutional. We can represent students' achievement in various ways in the course or unit level. As a teacher, I can walk to my student and provide some oral feedback. I can have a conversation with the student and tell the student how I would represent their abilities. That would be one way of representing the student's abilities. However, that is not typical at the institutional level. On an institutional level, we represent student achievement in transcripts or testimonies. We typically tend to represent student achievement in a way that you can see in the slide. I tried to find an example of a Deakin University of Wollongong transcript, which was surprisingly tricky. So I actually had to find my own old transcript from my master's degree. So here you can see it. The funny thing here is that it's in Finnish. So most likely you won't be able to understand what's going on here. It uses a grading scale that you would probably not be familiar with. Even then, from this a bit of an alien transcript, I think all of us can make the key points that are surprisingly universal. Here you can see that we have a list of the different units that I've done, or courses that I've done in this program. The credits are listed and the grades are listed as well. And that format is more or less universal. At least dramatically different transcripts are not that easy to find. Typically, this kind of a transcript is accompanied with some kind of a GPA, grade point average, or weighted average mark, which was also in mine, but you won't get to see it. There might be some markers of excellence. Perhaps your transcript shows that you were on a dean's list, on an honors list. But this is typically the kind of framing for what we're talking about with institutional representations of what students can do. Please let me know if in your institution there is something dramatically different going on in terms of this. I'm just going to skip this for the interest of time and ask, all right, if grades are only one way of representing what students can do. Are they doing a good job in this mission? This would of course depend on who we are doing the grading for. Who are we representing student achievement for? So next up, I will, roughly for 10-ish minutes, I will dig a bit deeper into the work that grades do in representing student achievement. And after that, I have some time for questions, after which we'll move on to some notable alternatives in this space. First of all, I wonder, and these are rhetorical questions, I'm not sure about the answer, particularly here in the Australian context, which is still a bit of a new context to me. But I wonder, should universities represent what students can do? I do think in this time of change, we do need to ask this question seriously. Maybe dramatically too. If universities should indeed represent what students can do, on what level of detail should that happen? How? For who? Should we simply leave this job for students and employers? At the present, students need to do a bulk of this work anyway. When I have applied jobs with the transcript that you could see a little piece of, yes, the grades were part of the story, but I, as the applicants, needed to build a story around those grades. I write my own resume, I write an application letter. It is up to me to really represent what I can do and use the transcript as a part of the bigger story. At the same time, employers are often testing the applicants to make sure that they have data on what they can do. Should this be the case? Do universities need to take part in this kind of a task in the first place? Not sure. Another option is that we leave this task for universities, but change the emphasis in terms of the role division. Perhaps this is not a job for teachers, but it's a job for career services that are already engaging in such important work in making sure that students meet our employability outcomes. Some rhetorical questions now, no easy answers here, but I think these are the sorts of questions that universities will need to engage with. But hold on, before we can talk about the work of representation, I do think we need to go back to basics. Why are we doing this? So next up, I'm going to discuss 3 very fundamental educational purposes of universities from the viewpoint of how good are grades in making this kind of work visible. I'm starting from a very fundamental question of what are universities for? What is the key mission that we are on? And here we might share a bit of a different view. I'm relatively new to Australia, and I've come to understand that as you move from country to country, you can really see the big differences in terms of what the overall sections and institutions are doing. What are the real core missions that are stated in some documents, but that are also put into practice? So even if we disagree on some of this, I hope we can agree, based on the lovely work by Paul Ashwin and colleagues, that there are 3 big educational purposes of universities that receive a bit different emphasis on different contexts. First, we want to make sure that students engage with knowledge, that they build their relation with knowledge. Second, we want to prepare students for employment. And finally, we want students to develop personally as unique graduates. How do grades feed into all of these 3 different purposes? I'll briefly walk you through this. First of all, this idea that universities are universities because they bring students in relationship with knowledge. This is a very old traditional idea of the university sector. Typically, this is something that distinguishes universities from vocational educational institutions. Yes, many parts of the universities prepare students for very particular professions, medicine, law, teacher education, and so forth. But even those programs tend to be quite theoretical compared to the vocational sector in itself. No matter what you think about this is simply a historical way of thinking about the institution. And then the question from the viewpoint of grading is, do grades communicate which bodies of knowledge students have learned about? how well they've done this, what have they done with the knowledge. I would actually say that if you look at this piece of my transcript, that again you can't read, but but you can see that these different units that I've done are listed there, and you can see the topics of the units if you know how to read Finnish, and then you can see the grades. I would actually argue that this transcript is doing pretty okay job in demonstrating the bodies of knowledge that I engage with. This particular transcript shows that as a student of special education, I engaged in quantitative research methods, and I engaged with knowledge about mathematical learning disabilities, for example. That again you can see from the slide if you know how to read Finnish. If I wouldn't know anything about this person whose transcript this is, at least I would have a list of the bodies of knowledge that the person engaged with. So, not the worst job, and at least there's some kind of an indicator of how well this relationship was built with knowledge. So, I don't think there are that dramatic issues in there. But let's move on to the second purpose of the whole university institution, preparing students for employment. Yes, we want our students to engage with knowledge, but of course we also want our students to get jobs. And this employability rationale is of course at the very center of contemporary higher education policies and practices. I think this is a more relevant question of many of us today. Do grades do a good job with communicating what students have achieved in university for employers? And here it gets quite interesting. And this is where I get a bit nervous because again, I've stayed in Australia for a relatively short amount of time. Many of you would have so much more experience than I do when it comes to applying for jobs from here, having the hidden great knowledge about how employability works in this system. But well, as a researcher, I'm certainly able to do my homework, but that only provides a very particular bit of knowledge about these issues. Anyway, let me provide some empirical insights on whether employers in Australia care about grades. There are some hints about the answer here, and please, if you have further insights, we can have a chat in a moment. There's a recent recruitment experience and outlook survey that provides some glimpses on this. The data is from 2022 and the report is from 2024. Give you a glimpse of this report. I tried to find an answer to the question, and here it seems that the important skills and qualities that are assessed at the application stage are very different in the Australian system than they would be at the interview stage. This might indicate that grades could play a higher role or bigger role in the application stage as some kind of a filter or an entry requirement. The most important skills and qualities in the application stage, according to the report, are relevant work experience and qualifications, and grades and your transcript would of course play a huge role in here. However, the skills and qualifications lose quite a bit of their power in the interview stage, where the most important skills and qualities as assessed by employers are approach or attitude to work and cultural fit, including personality and look, which is very interesting. It does make you think about the role that grades play in the employability sector and how that's changing, of course. If you can't imagine the amount of blog posts and LinkedIn posts that I was reading through as I was trying to get a sense of the gray, fuzzy knowledge in the sector that often doesn't get reproduced in official documents. It does seem like there's a lot of talk about GPA and WAM being used in the application phase as cutoff points, particularly for graduate programs. On the other hand, it is quite clear that many employers in Australia are using skills-based recruitment to test their applicants themselves, perhaps because they do not trust the work that universities do in this sense. A bit tricky to get validated knowledge about this because a lot of the reports that I found were produced by private companies, but there certainly seems to be something in these trends here. To put back my researcher hat, the issue here is that the information provided by a transcript is relatively scarce, meaning that students need to fill out the gaps in the information. How would you build a coherent narrative around your grades? Here are just some questions that students might need to answer in their job application or in their resume. For example, what can you still remember from a unit you did in 2023, even if you got the highest mark, a high distinction from years ago? Can you still remember what you did in that particular exam? How well can you apply what you learned perhaps in 2023 in a new situation or in a new context, with new people, with a new team, with a new group, by yourself, with others? What can you do with and without tools and materials? What can you do with Gen AI, without Gen AI? Can you make such a separation? All these sorts of gaps need to be filled by students and employers themselves, which, even if you buy the employability agenda, is certainly an issue from the grading point of view. All right, and finally, the third crucial mission of universities, personal development of students. We don't want to, in the university sector, I guess, to build a caricature. We don't want our students to be clones of each other or graduates to be robots. We want our students to graduate as unique persons in a knowledge society that use the knowledge that they have learned at the workplace as those unique, diverse individuals that they are. This is exemplified by a lot of work on professional identities. Who am I as a future professional? And this tends to be a determining factor between university and vocational education policies as well. This would take us to generic skills. And I tried to find the graduate learning outcomes of your university, but I couldn't, at least quickly. So what I did was that I checked the Deakin GLOs, as we call them. Here you can see the sorts of graduate learning outcomes that we in our institution find meaningful, ranging from problem solving to digital literacy to global citizenship. These are the sorts of very important skills, values, dispositions that we want our students to possess when they graduate. And we want it so badly that we have stated this in an official document. And we make sure that these ideas are integrated into day-to-day practices of teaching and learning in the courses and units. This is all extremely important, and it feeds into this idea of personal development. Now, the issue here is that these sorts of graduate learning outcomes are very rarely created. And I'm not saying that this should necessarily happen, but there simply is a gap between what we value and what we do. The answer here is probably not that we grade students on their global citizenship skills. Nevertheless, there is a different message to students when it comes to what is stated to be important and what is important at the level of grading. Moreover, the idea of personal development is that students are shaped and formed as unique knowledge workers, as diverse professionals who can use the knowledge that they learn in their own unique, divergent ways. But there's not much room in grading to make any of this divergence visible. And again, it is up to the students themselves to build a narrative about who they are in a job application or in any other kind of a situation. It's not just that I graduated from a special education degree with these grades, but by hiring me, you get a professional who is doing that work as me, as this whole holistic package. Again, up to students and employers. It is a matter of equity as well, because many forms of knowing, being, and doing are simply not something that can be made visible by these official frameworks of grading. And yes, some obvious examples of this might be indigenous knowledges, disabled knowledges, embodied knowledges. These are the sorts of things that we can't really capture with the work of grading. To summarize so far, and we are just reaching out the end of the first hour. Thank you for listening for quite a long time. I know it's reaching towards the end of the week. I'm going to summarize the message so far. So what I've argued is that we should shift our conversations from grades to how student achievement is institutionally represented. Conversations about grading, I argue, can exist and should exist, but only as a subcategory to talking about student achievement more generally. This leads us to questions about what is worth representing to whom, how, and why. And these are the questions that I think are necessary for the higher education sector to ask in these turbulent times. What I'll do now, before moving on to provide some examples of some notable alternatives, and before coming up with a bit of an activity for all of you, I would just like to ask if there are any questions about anything discussed so far. And I don't also know if it's a good idea to have a little bit of a break. It has been a long hour. Just see if there are any questions so far.
Yeah, we've got a question in the Q&A from Monty. She's put down, I think grades have been used by teachers as a way of rewarding extra or exceptional work. And there is a fear that without extra reward for deeper investigation engagement, students would simply stop learning once they've reached enough to pass and progress on their academic journey. The difference between universities and the vet sector is that unis are also on the pathway to higher degrees like PhDs, and staff typically want to encourage students to conduct meaningful research when studying, even if it's not a strict requirement of getting the degree. The extra marks are for the extra deeper work. If grades disappeared, would we lose our honours PhD pipeline because students wouldn't catch the research bug?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it heavily relates to the employability agenda of universities. I do think one of the big questions for sectors and institutions to consider is, again, the question of grading for whom. How much resources are we willing to invest in creating student work for other institutions? So using our resources right now to provide access to other institutions elsewhere, such as doctoral degrees or honors degrees. Sorry. My apologies. So yes, in the time of scarce resources, I do think that's a conversation worth having. Would we lose our honors or PhD pipeline? That's a very good question, and that's certainly something that we would not want to lose. I think there's also a question about the interaction between these different institutions and sectors in these situations. Might require us to engage in some conversations about the school university transitions as well. And yes, indeed, as seen from some of the empirical data that are presented too, indeed, there are students who think that they might just stop learning if grades were not there, which could be used as an argument to keep grades as they are, but it could also be used as an argument to say that something's a bit off in that situation, and we might want to shape students' motivation to begin with.
Monty, did you want to ask anything? Oh, Mercedes has got a hand up. Hang on, I'll just unmute you. There you go. Go for it.
Thank you so much. This is great. And sorry, I didn't want to interrupt the Monty question either, but I was wondering in your research, I guess, if you found things that are discipline specific. So I find that like I come from the School of Business originally, so I could find that, understanding if a student is able to do a certain task well, then that's okay. We probably could eliminate some of those grades. But I'm thinking about more like medicine. So, going on to, I know pre-med's very tough and looks at grades to go to that next level medical school. So similar to what Monty is saying about honors and PhD students, but also once you get into medical school, so I'm thinking just, hypothetically, if I had a brain surgeon, I would much prefer a brain surgeon who had high distinction marks than one who just passed. So I was just wondering in your research if you came across discipline specific nuances? Thanks.
Absolutely, that's a very good question. The answer is definitely. It's all extremely discipline specific. The question is how exactly to kind of define discipline specificity. Terrible. And one of the big differences here, of course, would relate to whether the degree is a professional degree or not. Medical education, of course, would be an example of something, of a degree that leads you to a very particular, often accredited profession. I guess medical education always accredited profession. So creates a very particular role in there in terms of making sure that the graduates are actually capable in working in the profession, which is not the case in many other degrees. For example, my own background is from mathematics, which is a very non-professional general degree, a very different kind of a role for why do we grade. It's also a matter of the different structures of knowledge in different disciplines. For example, in my world of mathematics, knowledge is relatively measurable. We talk about first-year undergraduate courses, providing grades as a sort of a measurement of students' level of abilities. It's simply easier than, say, when I think about my own teaching in a master's level education course, where knowledge is a bit more fuzzy, more personal. There are different viewpoints, different epistemologies, paradigms, providing one single grade for all the complexity. For assessing something like ethical reflexive thinking might be a bit more tricky. That would be one way of looking at disciplinary differences. And of course, there's also a cultural element in terms of whether what is in a second normal, typical practice, and whether assessment and grading, whether it is something that can be shifted and changed. For example, there's a lot of work in the STEM disciplines that might be able to do the work of free design, but it doesn't seem to fit the working culture. So many different viewpoints here. And maybe one very important thing to know, to add, relates to the actual level of competition. For example, one of the things that has surprised me in Australia in the medical context is the idea that students, when they enter a program, they need to be able to enter another program, such as their honors or masters, and you need to have high grades to move on there, rather than having the, I guess, more European model where you are accepted to a program and then you're in the long pipeline after which you graduate and go to work. So of course, if you need to filter hundreds of students and only pick the best 10% of them, grades provide a very, I guess, a nice little handy way of doing that. Whether that's meaningful work or not, I'm not sure, but it certainly allows us to do the calculations that we need to do in that situation. So a long, rambling answer, but yes, and we do need to break down what we mean by discipline specificity.
And potentially pathways, right? So you just nailed that one too with pathways, is that if you are in a non-professional degree and you're trying to get into a pathway into a postgraduate professional degree, and you have no way of measuring the entry criteria, but like you said, so potentially in Europe, you've got no entry criteria except the completion of that. But if you've got somebody in pre-med who have high marks, or mathematics who might have that, and then you might have somebody in the arts who don't, how do you differentiate between acceptance of that student into the next pathway, which I think you've identified as an issue. So thank you very much.
Oh, Monty, you have your hand up.
Yes, hello. Sorry, apologies.
Hey.
I'm sick at home today, so I won't turn on my video. Apologies. I just had one more question around the. I really like the question: who is the grading for? Like for whom? And when I consider the employers, I think you're right. Employers use the qualification as a mechanism to determine who they're going to interview. But then when it comes to interview, there's a whole other heap of other questions that come into it. But what I've found that employers tend to do is they'll pick certain gatekeeper subjects, or subjects that they think are the most relevant to them. And I come from an engineering background, so that might give you a bit more of an understanding. And they will sponsor a prize at the faculty prize night for the student with the highest mark in subject X, because they think that subject is the most relevant to them. I guess if there were no grades, so first of all, the employers do that to foster more of a relationship with who they see as up and coming potential future employees, obviously. If there were no grades, I don't know that they would be as keen to sponsor a prize if they couldn't sort of guarantee it went to the highest performing student, at least as far as they're concerned.
This also fascinating. Oh, thank you so much, Monsi. It's a fascinating difference in the engineering space in your particular context of the working in the engineering space for a little bit myself. Like in Finland, that kind of thing certainly wouldn't happen in that context. So it's fascinating to see how it's sometimes about disciplinary differences and sometimes about other contextual differences. Because even disciplines might differ quite a bit in different places.
Thanks. It wasn't a question, it was more of a comment.
And that was my response.
Joe.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you. Really, all this discussion, I'm very impressed by, I think, how much really is a cultural issue. It is not to do with system design, in a way that we are very wedded to this. I'm, with some of the discussion that's been going on about why do we need it, I think this is really great to kind of think about who's it for and what do we really care about. I come from the creative arts and humanities discipline, so which means that, we're quite used to telling students that employers for a designer will want to look at your portfolio rather than what your grades are. And sometimes getting into those fields, having a degree is important, but showing what you could, so there's already method of showing what you can do. But I'm also wondering, I think last week we talked about the students come from the culture of schools. And schools already have this indoctrinated this idea of that grades being rewards and showing what is. So it's very hard to change, I think, as a tertiary level. But having said that, in Australia, I know there are already very many different types of secondary school completion, certificates, across the states, and going to university, we have the ATAR. But there's also other alternatives like the International Baccalaureate or a portfolio type. And I know that in the UK as well, moving from many years ago from O levels to GCSE is a way of actually saying how you actually can create this portfolio work. Is there something in all this work and development that we have already done that we can actually take some ideas from, that we can move towards this more holistic way of needing to demonstrate what can this graduates do from those?
Thank you, Joe. Again, wonderful question, and I think answering this properly would require me to write a book or two. So let me do my best to answer in a succinct form. I do think that this was probably the time for the university sectors to take a stand. As you say, the matters of grading, they start already from quite early on. When students come to the university, they already have a history with grading, often quite a long one. And I do think the universities could take a stronger role in denoting the values and practices that they believe in, and aim to change the sort of trajectory that students have with grades if needed. For example, if students come from a highly competitive environment and enter a program that actually wants to develop them as ethical, responsible practitioners, then there might be a need to quite radically alter the culture of grading and make them visible to students. So I do think that this is a situation for universities to take a stand and believe in their values. But that's a very streamlined answer.
Thank you.
Can see that Sadaf has provided some commentary in the chat in and around AI and critical thinking and grades, but I can see you've got your hand up, so would you like to unmute?
Hello, thank you so much for the session. Yes, the session was really nice. Thank you for the session. It was very informative. I like the way it was structured around students, teachers, and then the employers. But after leading about subjects for about 2 years now at UOW, I have just realized that we need to go ahead and have some form of component in our grading sheet, which talks about, has AI replaced critical thinking in that particular write-up or that submission that has come in? Because you might find students in class who have never spoken a word and suddenly some kind of submission has come in, which is amazing. Well done. We do conduct vivas to figure out what's going on, but then there needs to be some form of marking criteria which can be, which captures this and then can be actually measured using a viva to substantiate it. And then I did encourage my class to go ahead and have, because they were designing posters and stuff, and they were like, can we use AI tools? They're amazing AI tools which can create posters for my product. And I was like, you can, and then put in a note which indicates which tool did you use. In fact, write the prompt that you used, which makes me understand what kind of inputs did you give in to get that kind of result out. So that would help me understand that you did put in efforts in making sense of what you were doing. So I think grading marking criterias also need to change. Maybe that's something that I would like to suggest.
Absolutely, it would be very hard to disagree with that. And for me, in the context of today's presentation, that's again a matter of the final representation of what students can do. So yes, even if we've completely redesigned the marking criteria, we come up with a wonderful rubric and wonderful assessment methods, vivas, oral assessments. The final representation, if we leave that untouched, to me, that is an issue. When it comes to these bigger conversations about how students engage with Gen AI, whether they do it or not, and if so, how exactly does it happen? And in either case, why do they do whatever they do? All this information might be coded in the assessment task. You might get bits and pieces out of this in your viva, but in the final representation of a grade, a lot of the information disappears. Okay. And as a form of communication, again, that's up to the students to reproduce those narratives later on. For example, as an employer, I might be interested in knowing about the students' critical thinking with and without Gen AI tools. None of that is seen in the final mark in itself or the grade in itself. Okay. So we're saying it's incredibly important, and I would take a step further and think about the way we code information about student abilities in that situation with response to AI, which is a massive, massive thing. One of those things that I can easily talk about, but how to do it in practice is a whole issue.
Thank you.
It seems like there are no more hands up, so maybe
not at the moment. So maybe
I'll take this opportunity to wrap up my presentation, and the next part will be much shorter than the previous one. And now, just give me a moment. All right, so we have around 45 minutes left. I'm going to use around 15 minutes to wrap up by noting some notable alternatives to representing what students can do beyond grades. After that, I have a bit of an activity because I'm very interested in hearing from your perspective, what do you see as the biggest challenges in this space, but also the biggest things to hold on to as we think about alternatives in the future. From the viewpoint of redesigning how we represent student achievement, to me, that kind of work could start from these kinds of 3 critical questions. These are the sorts of questions that I think we should be engaging with. The answers, of course, are not easy to determine. First of all, as we represent student achievement in one way or another, what should be cared for and protected? What are the most important things that we prioritize and hang on to? Second, we could start all over again. What would we do differently? If we try to forget about the cultural baggage of grades, like Joe, you were talking about that cultural and historical baggage that comes with grades. If we forget about that, at least for a moment, what would we do differently? We could design the system from the ground up. And finally, what kinds of new conceptual resources could we help to develop to help us do this work? Big questions, and I have some snippets of answers here. I'm going to start. So I'll introduce 3 different ideas. These are not just my own ideas. They stem from that paper introduced earlier with my lovely Cradle colleagues. But I'll start from a suggestion that if we do need to use grades, as we so often do, how could we do them better? So in the spirit of moving towards something rather than away from something, I could argue that in so many different occasions, higher education cares deeply about numbers. Numbers are worth our care and attention. You could see this in the conversation just before on pathways. We really want to make sure that we pick the best PhD candidates, or the best students to honors programs or master's programs. We care about these numbers because they allow us to do this work in ways that we see as fair, perhaps meritocratic. So here I would ask, okay, if we care about these numbers, how can we do them better? Because we know that these numbers are often flawed at best. Again, the work of grading is not done by psychometricians, but by educators. We also know that the calculations that we use for these numbers are even worse. Unfortunately, there is a long history of work showing how the grade point average and weighted average mark calculations use statistical tools in ways that do not always make sense. Nevertheless, we use them because they allow us to rank students for the purposes that we have. So how might we do numbers better in those situations where we simply need to stick to grades? One very important conceptual resource here is the idea of validity. And perhaps here I would pair up this idea of validity with transparency. Saint Ong and colleagues define validity as a journey on which one embarks to provide evidence supporting the interpretation of scores. And this journey is certainly something that is not often seen in student transcripts. This is the journey that students themselves must provide. For example, the conversation before about critical thinking and AI. If we want our assessment score, or the mark, the grade, to tell us what students can do with or without AI, this needs to be coded into that representation in itself. If I see your grade, high distinction, how do I interpret that? It doesn't provide me the tools to interpret whether you were able to reach that high distinction with Gen AI tools. If so, how did you use those tools? Were you also making sure that your critical thinking skills were in there as you were engaging with those tools? All those conversations get hidden and lost. Saint Ong and colleagues asked us to think about which aspects of learning can be measured, which cannot, and focus on those that indeed can be made visible through the tools of educational measurement. How could we build a chain of evidence of validity? This to me is the biggest question in here. A chain of evidence of what were the learning objectives? What were the assessment methods? What was the ultimate grade? This is something that often gets hidden from the transcript. And I wonder if in the future, and this is a big question, if we could somehow provide the chain of evidence in the actual transcript. So for anyone interested in seeing what students can do, they would see what was actually assessed, again, what sorts of criteria, with what sorts of tools, in what kind of a context. How to supplement quantified measurements with other forms of data. These are some of the big questions for us to engage with in the future. The second proposal stems from the world of narrative assessment. Quantified data affords us to do certain things, but not others. When creating data remains categorical and hierarchical, it allows us to neatly rank students and pick the ones with a higher score. Yet it is not always that we should center our care towards these sorts of ranking situations. In many cases, we want to make sure that we care for holistic, complex, and dynamic representations of achievement. Here, I'm using the work of Henrik and his colleague Lai, whose first name I can't remember, as a conceptual resource. They write about the affordances of learning data and the different affordances that a particular data allows us to do. If we allow universities to use narrative verbal forms of grading or representation, this might afford us to do new things with the data, and I'll unpack this in the following slides. And again, just to emphasize this idea, students already do this elsewhere. Students are the ones who provide these narratives around their grades in other situations. What might such narrative arcs contain? Here we could learn a lot from the medical education context that have used narrative assessment systemically and at scale for quite some time. With narratives that might be written, but that might also include other formats of material, images, videos, audio, and so forth, we might be able to answer the sorts of questions such as, what can I do with and without tools, support, scaffolding, and materials? What can I do by myself and with others? When does this division matter? How might this shift and fluctuate across different contexts and situations? What is the time span of ability, achievement, competency? If I learn something in the first year, can I still do it? I'm not proposing this kind of a narrative system as an easy solution. Absolutely not. It might very well be, and there's evidence of this already, that students can learn to game the system of narratives too. And we all know this from job application situations where we have to produce a very performative narrative that brings us to where we want to go. Nevertheless, this kind of data would afford us to do new things compared to simply numerical data. One thing that narrative representations allow us to do that grades do not allow us to do relates to students' own active role. Here I'm using a conceptual resource by Rola Achavi and David Bout, who have been writing about active portrayal as a counterpart to representation of achievement. What this means is that rather than assigning worth and recognition to student work from the outside, we train students to do this themselves. This stems from a care for students' agency in portraying what they can do in ways that they see as meaningful. Basically meaning that students themselves take part in the work of representation. Rather than me as a teacher providing a grade for you, my role as a teacher is to support my students in producing active portrayals about what they can do with respect to some learning objectives as their own unique personas. And finally, there's quite a bit of policy attention at the moment towards removing grades. So this is something that I did want to note in my presentation. I wonder what we could afford by taking the absence of grades seriously. There is quite a bit of talk internationally and here in Australia too about removing grades, teaching students without grades, ungrading, gradeless learning. So there's a lot of work to build on, but I wonder what we could achieve if we wouldn't see ungrading as undoing, as critique, as moving away from something, but as reassembling. What is not represented? What kind of achievement is not represented because we care about something so much that we do not, in fact, want to represent it? If we center a more stronger idea of the absence of grades, what might we be able to achieve? Here, I'm drawing on a very inspiring body of work on ungrading. Contemporary names in this area, I want to mention Jesse Stommel and Susan Plum, but there is a longer history of teaching without grades in universities. There's quite a bit of work on this in the 1960s. Max Marshall is a nice example of that. So there is a lot to build on. Now, Rather than simply advocating for removing grades as some kind of a relatively simple solution, I am going to take the viewpoint of representation of achievement. The question for me is, okay, if we might be able to use pass or fail grading system to promote student motivation, well-being, social relationship, we might be able to reduce competition. These are the sort of things that this literature on grading has already unpacked in great length. And these days are also backed up with empirical evidence in many cases, yet not all cases. Nevertheless, for us today, the question is, how could we represent what students can do with on grading? I would like to note here that pass or fail is still a grade. It's still categorical and hierarchical data. It simply just has two categories. So a couple of thoughts here before finishing up. First of all, there might be situations for us when we care about things that we do not want to, or things that we cannot assess. We already nurture many of these moments and capabilities that we wish to be developed in universities, but we do not formally assess. For example, we often see university as a place for making friends and building connections, but we certainly do not try to represent students' abilities in making friends in university. The question for me is, how could we take these unassessed experiences seriously and making the most of them? How can we build a balanced system where we represent what students can do meaningfully, but also pay attention to all the important work that happens in the university sector that is not represented in any kind of way? Of course, many of these situations would not be related to learning objectives, such as indeed making friends, but many of them are. I mentioned the Deakin graduate learning outcome of global citizenship, for example. It might be that for me to develop my global citizenship skills, I would need to be provided some breathing spaces for exploration and failure, rather than carefully assured, organized situations of assessment. So what are those skills, values, achievements that we deeply care about, but do not want to assess? Right. This is, to me, also a matter of intangibility. Grades are typically an attempt to grasp and measure something in the world and turn that into a numerical indicator. But in many cases, we wish to care for those moments of learning that cannot be rendered into any tangible indicators of achievement, numbers, graphs, narratives. Or at least this might result into relatively clumsy representations. Just some examples here. Many forms of embodied knowledges, disabled knowledges, indigenous knowledges. These are the sorts of knowledge systems that we already know exist, that we already care for, but do not often bring into the world of grading. In some of my earlier work with some wonderful colleagues, we've had a look at how the way we grade always denotes tangibility, and in doing so, often connects this idea of success with tangibility. To be successful means to get a high grade, and getting a high grade means that whatever you can do has to be able to put into an indicator. In our work, we had a look at disabled students in university, having a look at how the students did have a lot of knowledge resources and a lot of skills and abilities that could not be captured by grading, meaning that their learning, even though it was there, was denoted as something messy, intangible, and in doing so, it was also labeled as failure. This, of course, would require quite a lengthy conversation, but I do wonder in the futures of higher education what will happen for these intangible elements. All right, I have been talking for a very, very long time. We still have around 20-25 minutes. So I would like to hear a bit from you. I prepared a little bit of a task, and I reckon we could use around 5 to 10 minutes with this. So just a small task, but nevertheless. When we talk about assessment trading, we often get tangled with practicalities, the world that we live in, the resources that we have. And for the next 10-ish minutes, I would like us to do the opposite. I would like you to think about your ideal future of grading. Imagine just for a moment this beautiful utopia taking place in 2050. In the near future, it's not hundreds of years away, but still there's quite a bit of time before this happens. Think about this from your own particular point of view. Your particular course, unit, program, degree, from the viewpoint of your particular role, whether that's teacher, educator, program leader, take that role. And from that viewpoint, think about the utopia where student achievement is represented in perfect ways, exactly as you wish it would happen in your particular context. In this beautiful utopia, there are infinite resources, time, money, staff to do this kind of work. How would this utopia look like? Would it have grades? And I'm very interested in hearing what you think of this. I've prepared a little Padlet for this, and I would like you to think about two questions. First of all, in the spirit of not just critiquing, but moving towards something, for you, what is the most important thing to value and care about as we represent student achievement? What is something that you are not willing to let go of? Something that you would prioritize above anything else? Again, in your particular context. And then, how does your 2050 utopia look like? I will also just chuck the link into chat, but here you can also follow the QR code. Just one moment. All right, share my screen. Just tried to do and failed. I know that some of you asked. Yeah, wonderful. I know many of you are still typing, just having a look at the time, and I think you might prefer to end a bit early because it has been a long day. So I just wanted to take a look at some of these absolutely wonderful responses. It's very interesting to see what kinds of problems are shared in this area amongst everyone of us today, but also what sorts of values we hold. And this is something that I often use these utopia tasks for. It might seem like a silly idea to talk about something that is not achievable. And at the same time, I do think it's important, even if only for 10 minutes, to sometimes focus our attention on those higher end goals and values that we have in mind that we should be striving towards, even if we can never really make it to the proper utopia we have in mind. So let's see, and you might also find it interesting to go and read some of the work by others. I really like the idea by Coast Wanderer that in a perfect utopia, all education would be delivered one-on-one with a mentor that would produce full reports on the strengths and weaknesses of the individual student. Indeed, this kind of almost like an apprenticeship model is often as an ideal model that we have in mind. Sometimes something that we try to replicate with bigger student numbers in the university sector. And what I think is so powerful about this kind of an idea is that the relationship between the one whose achievement is represented and the one doing it is closer and perhaps even longitudinal. This counteracts the idea that we often have in grading that to do good work in grading, there shouldn't be any relationship, but grading should be objective, like any measurement. So the idea that achievement should be represented by someone who knows you based on this one-on-one model, it's built on a very different kind of a premise. By the way, if anyone has any particular questions about any of these reflections, do let us know. Otherwise, I'll just pick a few things to comment myself. Alice has written that a shift in focus on what information students can reproduce towards how effectively they can think, create, and act in complex real-world contexts. Indeed, and I think this goal is something that many would already share. Nevertheless, it's something that is not covered in student transcripts. So how to not just nurture these sorts of very important skills in practice, and it's not only about how to assess them, but how to represent this complexity in a transcript or in any kind of an institutional format is a very tricky question. I do think there's something for us to consider about the real world context as well. How could we as educators support students in representing how they can bring whatever they learn in our classrooms into the so-called real world, which again is often something that students do themselves in applications and so forth. There's a snail who is optimistic, saying that the an important value to nurture is that we are empowering students to be best placed for reflecting, representing, and accounting for their achievements. This would certainly be something that I would personally always advocate for, particularly having worked with quite a few students and graduates who are not really trained on making these sorts of representations themselves, but might be quite reliant on someone else doing it for them. Let's have a look. For a cluster arranger, teaches in an area with professional standards, the first priority is providing students with opportunities to demonstrate those standards. I'm much less interested in how well they can do them. To me, this comment really denotes the separation between professional degrees and the ones that are more generic. I'm not sure if that's the right word here, but and the importance of thinking about the matters of creating a representation in these very different sorts of contexts. Indeed, the whole system of a pass or fail could mean different things in terms of where the standard is, and whether the kind of a binary decision relates to a rigorous professional standard. Let's see. And Hassan's also writing about lifelong learners, solving future societal challenges, improving society. These, again, are some of those extremely important goals for the university sector, and the promise that we have that our graduates could indeed do these things out there in the world. And I'm simply concerned that this work, as important as it is, remains quite separate from the work of grading, which tends to take quite a bit of the time and workload of us educators. But yes, very, very important goals. Let me just finally read a comment by Johanna. Here too we return to the smaller class sizes and personalized materials. Maybe I'll stop sharing at this point so you don't have to stare at my face reading these comments, but thank you so much. I think this is quite a nice collection of ideas, and I really hope that maybe after this you can even take your time and read through these. It gives a very nice sense of hope to me for bringing these very important lofty goals of the university institution together with the work of grading and representation. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Again, I know it's been a long presentation to listen to, and I think we are ready to wrap up. I'll just leave you with one final slide. I wanted to end today's session with the words of Patricia Proudfoot, who is a sociologist of assessment. In the work of grading, one of the frustrating things for me as a researcher is that whenever you think you have a good idea, someone else has said it before. And this repetitive cycle of assessment, feedback, and grading is certainly not something that went unnoticed by Proudfoot. And I wanted to end with her words from 1998. Proudfoot was arguing that universities need to move on in how they approach assessment. Yet, according to her, it is peculiarly ironic that at the very time when these institutions are facing a challenge to change on what is arguably an unprecedented scale, they are being caught up as never before in the trammels of formal assessment, which are binding them ever more tightly to the status quo. And I think it's almost an omen to bring this idea into the world, a world of Gen AI, the post-pandemic world. So many systems are shifting around us, and it might be that grading is one of those systems that keeps us grounded in the past. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a wonderful 2 hours and excellent ideas. If you happen to have any further thoughts, questions, ideas, please do not hesitate to reach out to me in this address.
Thank you so much, Juuso, for a wonderful provocation. And yeah, I think we could keep going on about it. It's stimulating so many ideas as to where we need to go. But again, as our participants know, we keep articulating we're trying to change things without being restricted by policy or systems or anything like that, to work out what is really meaningful and what will help students and in their future careers as well. So it's great. Some lovely thank yous in the comment. And as Elise has posted the link up there, we seek your feedback. She said it was still loading, so it should be working now. We encourage you to provide the feedback, and we'll also share that with you as well, but it will definitely inform where we go as part of our think tank and our reimagining assessment. So thank you again, Juuso. Really appreciate your time, expertise and insights.
Thanks so much,
everyone. Thanks everyone for joining us again, and make sure you register for the last 2 provocations which occur next week.